Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here. Today's video is a theory-based one, so we're going to discuss the judgment of distance within Di Grassi's 16th century Italian fencing system. This is a very important branch of fencing theory to understand in order to be an effective swordsman, and Di Grassi says as much within the text of his work. Unfortunately, although Di Grassi's system contains an implicit understanding of distance, he never explicitly codified how we can judge or measure the concept of distance within a fight, which is an unfortunate omission from his work. So in today's video, I'm going to borrow some ideas from other Italian fencing masters and try to rationalize and categorize distance within the Di Grassi system. So I'll do that categorization first, and then later in the video I'll talk about some tactical issues that might arise out of that. The first thing I need to specify to you is that Di Grassi doesn't really have a technical term for talking about distance, but in the wider Italian fencing tradition, it's common to use the term misura, meaning measure. So within fencing as a whole, measure is the distance between two fencers during a fencing bout. So I'm going to use the word in that way throughout this presentation, but it is not used within Di Grassi's treatise. So this is an addition to his basic theory. Okay, so my understanding and my experience leads me to suggest that there are 4 categories of measure that you really need to understand. So starting from the biggest, working our way towards the smallest, these are out of measure, wide measure, misura larga, narrow measure, misura stretta, and coming to grips, so alla presa. So, if you can understand and recognize these 4 categories during a fight, it will greatly help your tactical approach to the exchange. So let's go through the 4 one at a time and define each one as carefully as we can, and I'll give you some tips for how to recognize these distances. So, first of all, out of measure. The fencers in this photograph are out of measure, so they are too far apart to effectively interact with each other. So what that means is they cannot strike each other with their weapons. And that means they can't strike each other at all. They can't hit each other's body or head, the central target, nor can they hit each other's extended targets, their sword arm, for example. They may be able to just clip the very end of each other's blades and to perform a little tapping beat, but this would not be an effective action because they are too far apart to follow up from it. So that's out of measure. Okay, you're too far away to hit the other person at all. If you move a little bit closer, you will find yourself at wide measure, and this diagram from Di Grassi's 1570 book shows 2 fencers on guard at wide measure. Within the Di Grassi system, you can recognize this because if both fencers are stood on guard in the Di Grassi style, so with the withdrawn sword arm and sword hand, the blades of the weapons will not be overlapping. Okay, so there will be a little gap between the tips of the weapons. The size of this gap can vary a little. I would suggest about a handspan's gap is usually when wide measure begins. So all of these measures have a little variability to them. So this is an approximate measurement. With regards to attacking the opponent at wide measure, you will be able to interact with extended targets. So you could beat the blade of the opponent's sword, or you might be able to attack to their sword arm or their lead leg if either of those limbs was extended for some reason. If you want to offend the central target, the torso or the head, then it will be necessary to perform a large movement or two small movements. So in the Grassi system, that means to thrust somebody in the torso, as an example, you would need to move 1, 2 in order to reach them from wide measure. Alternatively, 1 full step, 1 large step forwards. So that is wide measure. It's a distance at which you can perform big attacks. A little bit closer again, and we reach narrow measure. The fencers in this diagram, borrowed from Vincenzio Saviolo's 1595 book, show 2 fencers at narrow measure. So basically, they are close enough where the blades overlap a little bit, and they can reach out and strike each other's central target with a simple action. In other words, by an extension of the arm or with a short step with the lead foot. So that is narrow measure. Now, in his book, De Grassi very briefly uses another term which is related to narrow measure, which is finding yourself at the half sword, mezza spada. In this second diagram from Saviolo's work, we can see more clearly 2 fencers at the half sword. So they're at narrow measure with their blades crossing at approximately the halfway point, hence at the half sword. So that's another way to kind of recognize or judge the distance of narrow measure. If we move a little bit closer again, we arrive at the closest of all distances in fencing, which is coming to grips distance. These fencers from Camillo Agrippa's mid-16th century book have come to grips. So quite simply, this means that they are capable of reaching out and grabbing or gripping each other with their hands. And of course, this leads to wrestling and grappling techniques, throws, arm locks, pushing and shoving, disarms, this type of thing. So the way to recognize coming to grips is with a simple extension of the arm, you can somehow grab your opponent somewhere about their person. So those are the 4 categories of measure as I understand them, put within a De Grassi context. So we've got out of measure, wide measure, narrow measure, coming to grips. So having defined these measures, let's go on now to talk about some tactical implications, shall we say, of these. In my experience as a fencer and as a fencing instructor, there are a lot of problems that come out of people having a poor judgment of distance. And actually, a surprising number of fencers can't judge distance as well as they think. So the 2 biggest problems occur at the opposite extremes of distance. So there are a lot of people who think they are at wide measure when they are actually slightly out of measure. Now, this is a big problem because they start to perform actions such as beats or feints or the sort of large attacks which are meant to be performed at wide measure. But none of these actions are effective because they're slightly too far away. An opponent can see them coming very easily and take evasive action, or they can simply not react at all, which is the worst result for you if you have made this mistake, because at the end of your movement, whatever it is, a feint, a beat, an attack, the opponent will simply be waiting for you on guard. And at the extension of your technique, he will be able to strike you with a narrow measure technique, or maybe a wide measure technique. Okay, so it's very dangerous for you to take a fencing action at out of measure distance. There are only two legitimate actions you should take from out of measure. One is to rest, which is important if your arm is tired, so you can recover a bit of energy in your muscles. And two is to move forwards in order to gain the wide measure. These are the only two things you should do when you are out of measure. Jumping ahead now to coming to grips. So another common error of judgment is fencers think that they are at the narrow measure, where they can perform very powerful short actions with the blade of their swords, little thrusts, short half-cut actions, but they misjudged it and they are actually at coming to grips distance. This is really dangerous because it allows the opponent to easily enter inside the arc of your sword and grab your sword arm or the hilt of your weapon, and then perform some kind of finishing move on you from a wrestling context. Of course, it should also be noted that as a trained swordsman with a big weapon in your hand, you want to use the blade to its best advantage, and coming to grips distance is not good for blade work. So you must develop good sense of judgment. Do not allow yourself to accidentally move into coming to grips distance where your sword becomes less effective and an opponent can rely on grappling to counteract your sword skills. So I would say those are the two key things to watch out for. So there is this optimal distance at which to engage with your opponent, so being within measure, so to speak, which we can subdivide into wide measure and narrow measure. A wide measure is for making big, expansive actions, and narrow measure is for making short, quick, decisive actions. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to say for today. This is actually a very complex topic and a very important one, and there's a limit to how much I can explain and show in a simple video like this. But I hope this gives you some ideas for how to rationalize judgment of distance, or measure in other words, within your own fencing. So I'll finish there. Take care everyone, and I'll be back soon with another video. Bye for now.